Welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee, helping to guide you through events of the past 7 days, looking deeper at what's happened as well as why and where it's heading, with a panel of 4 distinguished international correspondents offering their analysis and assessment. In a week that a major war broke out in the Middle East when the US and Israel attacked Iran from the skies with airstrikes that assassinated the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and at least 40 senior Iranian officials, all reportedly within a 5-minute period at the start of the bombing campaign on Saturday morning. Now day 7, and as other names in the regime are hunted, hundreds of police and paramilitary bases continue to be bombed. So too Iran's ballistic missile and drone launch sites, storage facilities and naval fleets. The legal justification being put forward by President Trump that Iran posed an imminent threat to Tel Aviv and Washington is disputed. The war plans of the Trump administration and accounts from the team appeared contradictory. The president initially spoke of regime change, telling the nation to rise up and seize a once-in-a-generation moment. His Secretary of War said it was anything but regime change.
When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations.
This is not a so-called regime change war, but the regime sure did change, and the world is better off for it.
It's been a week that's seen the conflict spread across the Gulf and into Europe too, as Iran retaliated, firing missiles and drone strikes across more than a dozen countries where US bases or troops are stationed or are accused to have aided Washington. Governments around the world scrambled to evacuate tourists after hotels as well as airports in Dubai and Abu Dhabi were struck. Fuel depots, embassies, energy infrastructure targeted by Tehran too. In Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan. There was a drone attack on the British military base in Cyprus, while the Iranian Revolutionary Guard announced it had closed the Straits of Hormuz, the corridor where 1/5 of the world's oil travels through.
Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, from now on, all navigating through the Strait of Hormuz is forbidden. No ship in every type is not allowed to pass from the Strait of Hormuz till next notice.
And it's been a week that's seen Israel restart its bombing campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon, hitting the capital Beirut, sending in troops with reports of a so-called sterile zone being created in the south. We wait for more news from the IDF. Well, this is in response, they say, to rockets and drones fired by the Shia Muslim militia group who threaten to avenge the killing of the Ayatollah. And as the conflict seems to spread somewhere new every day, the UK, France and Germany have committed to, quote, defensive action to protect Gulf countries. But there were few words of appreciation from President Trump, angered at Britain's delay in allowing US troops and planes to land at UK bases. As the Prime Minister Keir Starmer said, lessons have been learned from, quote, the mistakes of Iraq, stipulating the US could only use sites in England and on the Indian Ocean island of Diego Garcia for defensive actions, targeting missile sites, not the regime. Cue a major rift in the once so-called special relationship of bygone times.
It's taken 3-4 days for us to work out where we can land there. It would have been much more convenient landing there as opposed to flying many extra hours. So we are very surprised. This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with.
Alongside me on the panel this week, Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine and Fortune magazine, a great friend of the programme as well. Good evening, Viv. Let me ask you about your week and what you've been focusing on.
Hard to believe it's only been a week.
No.
But I have been looking at what's happened to the Gulf, which has been a kind of island of stability, prosperity, place with thousands of expats and, wonderful cappuccino bars and luxury hotels. And the sort of week that bubble burst and reality bit, with tremendous consequences for the world. We're not just talking about oil. We're talking about enormous data lines that go through the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. This is like another choke point and real vulnerability, which I think people are only just beginning to focus on.
Very interesting on some of the influences, the tourists, those that have resided now as second home expats, as the Brits call them, because the Lib Dem leader this week in the UK kind of targeting them, saying that if you want to come back, we'll evacuate you on the planes, but maybe think about paying taxes in the UK.
It is really hard to imagine that we would have been having this conversation even a week ago. you have so many expats, young professionals, families, etc., who've decamped to Dubai, Abu Dhabi, very low taxes, prosperous economies. The Gulf countries are now thinking of reviewing their entire investment strategy because they've been so badly hit by the first week of this war. We don't know how long it's going to last.
It's a very good point. One brief story it's a triage of news. It is worth a brief mention, which is suddenly in the US, the US Secretary for Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, is no more. Reportedly, poor performance in the face of President Trump's controversial immigration crackdown. What are you making of that?
It was impossible for her to stay. I mean, she should have been gone months ago, of course. I mean, there's been the debacle over the ICE operations in, of course, Minneapolis, but not just Minneapolis, in, Washington, in LA, in Portland, in other cities. And it's become clear as the elections are growing near, the midterms, the primaries, the Republicans have done terribly badly in these primaries. It's clear that Democrats are turning out in force to vote. And there's a lot of concern among Trump's allies.
And it's always worth watching when there are big resignations. I know she's been moved to another post, but I'm thinking back to the Elon Musk fallout. It started pretty and then it got pretty ugly within weeks. So we'll be watching that. Viv, it's great to have you with us tonight. Let's also bring in another friend of the programme. We have Constant Moot, the Ukraine reporter for the New York Times, part of the New York Times' award-winning team that won the prestigious Hillman Prize for Journalism for your coverage in Haiti. Great to have you with us tonight,
Good to be here.
Constant. Let me ask you, in the midst of this kind of events in Iran, I want to get onto the knock-on effect on Ukraine, which there are tonight. But I also want to talk to you about kind of all eyes are on the Middle East right now. There is still pressure on President Zelensky from the US to come up with a peace deal. I think President Trump has said this week, quote, Putin's ready.
Yeah, which is not a message that's so new to the ears of the Ukrainians, right? Trump has again and again said that President Zelensky should make a step towards peace, should make more compromises. Whereas when you look at what's happening on the ground and the statements from both the Ukrainians and the Russians, it's often more the Russians who are unwilling to make compromises. I think at this point, the Ukrainians have pretty much understood that they should not take those messages for granted and just keep going, show that they're willing to host another trilateral round of talks, show that they're also willing to help the Americans and some countries in the Middle East respond to those strikes from Iran. So I wouldn't, be too much worried about this latest statement from President Trump.
While we're on air, just as you're talking, we have a statement from the Ukrainian foreign minister saying this. We've been able to secure, quote, the release of 7 Ukrainian nationals who were, quote, held in Budapest. This is an extraordinary story this week. The Hungarian government saying that this is a group of people that were trying to money launder through the country.
Right.
What's going on?
So we still have not a lot of information about what happened, but this is clearly the latest development in rising tensions between Hungary and Ukraine. Hungary being one of those EU member states that is probably the most friendly to Russia. The tensions revolved around an oil pipeline that supplies oil to Hungary from Russia to Hungary through Ukraine. The pipeline was struck by a Russian weapon earlier this year. The Ukrainians said that they were repairing the pipeline. The Hungarians said that the Ukrainians were not repairing it fast enough. And as a consequence, they blocked electricity exports to Ukraine. They blocked diesel exports to Ukraine. And this seemed to be the latest development in rising tensions between the two governments.
Wow, so it's money that was going apparently from Austria in a van, maybe up to 75 million in cash and gold. We don't yet know, but Ukraine saying this is a kidnapping of the 7 staff. Hungary saying that this was money laundering to be continued. Constant, great to have you with us as well tonight. Let's move from the studio. Let's go to Jerusalem. Let's welcome Jason Burke, the international security correspondent for The Guardian, a critically acclaimed author and one of the foremost writers on Islamist militancy. His latest book, The Revolutionist, the story of the extremists who hijacked the 1970s, now shortlisted for the UK's most prestigious award for non-fiction writing, the Baillie Gifford Prize. Welcome to the programme, Jason. And let's start with The Revolutionists. It is worth saying that it's particularly pertinent right now. It's an incisive account of the rise of modern terrorism following the founding of the state of... Well, will take us back to basically there's three things in common, isn't there, with all of these characters that you look at. It's a hatred of capitalism, it's a hatred of Israel, and a hatred of kind of moneyed European systems.
I'm looking at the late 1960s as a start point for both radical leftist terrorism that we saw in the 1970s, very notably, and also, interestingly, the start point for Islamist extremism, which obviously surged much later in the 80s, 90s, and so on, but shares many of the same enemies in terms of capitalism. Yes, Israel, the US, but also has the same revolutionary project. And I look at Iran actually as part of the book. I look at how the revolution happened, and the revolution in Iran was, again, at the time, an attempt to create a new society through violence, perhaps, but a new society that would bring social justice and a new vision of the world to the Iranian people. And it obviously went very badly wrong.
And The Guardian's own review of your work talks about how this is a portrait of militants less as ideologues, more as oddballs, that many were functionally illiterate when it came to theory. And this book is well timed. As you climax kind of the book's late chapters is the Iranian Revolution at the end of the decade.
Yeah, that's a little unfair to call them completely illiterate in terms of theory. I mean, some of them were pretty well versed in theory, and they spent a lot of time discussing theory. But it's certainly about radicalism and radicalization and how broader protest movements generate an extremist fringe, a violent fringe that can have all sorts of very counterproductive results and consequences. And I think that's one of the things that's I've been thinking about a lot in the last week, watching what's happening here, is that this whole cycle of violence started with a terrorist act or with a group that has used terrorist tactics in October 2023, and an extreme use of violence there, which triggered a whole series of consequences that nobody could anticipate at the time.
And there's a Paris link as well, Jason, it's worth saying, Carlos the Jackal. And Carlos the Jackal wasn't his real name.
No, his real name is Ilich Ramirez Sanchez. I was in touch with him. He's in a prison in France at the moment, having been picked up by French security in 1994 from Sudan. Clearly, he was very active in France in the mid-70s. But Carlos Jackal is a fascinating figure. I go into his detail. I dug up a lot of new stuff on him. And one of the most interesting things about Ilich Ramirez Sanchez is that he wasn't actually very good at the violence, but he was very good at the celebrity, and he exploited media and the fear he could inspire as a result of media then as a way of preserving his career and his own best interests. And that was a new phenomenon, an important one. So I go into that a fair amount, and it's relevant today. Terrorism is theatre, as somebody said at the time in the 70s, and it remains a very violent form of theatre, performative, aimed at sending a message, as much violence is.
And perhaps it's a hat tip to your paper as well, wasn't it, The Guardian, back in the 70s, that came up with the nickname The Jackal. There was a Frederick Forsyth novel in his room, is that right? It wasn't
right.
his, it was his girlfriend's, though.
That's right. It's a good story. It's a great book, actually. I mean, Day of the Jackal was such a wonderful representation and portrayal of clandestine violence at the time. But yes, there was a copy of The Day of the Jackal, the Forsyth book, in a house, a flat actually in London, which was where he had stayed for a while. Ilich Ramirez Sanchez had stayed for a while. He had a Basque girlfriend. It was her flat, and he'd left a bag there full of weapons. And there's no evidence that he actually read Day of the Jackal, but when journalists found it, they put that together with the name Carlos that was being used at the time for him by French police, and came up with Carlos the Jackal. And that's what stuck. That's what entered popular culture and the media at the time.
Oh, it's great to have you here, Jason. Congratulations, too, for being shortlisted as well. Let's complete our lineup. Let's go to London. Let's bring in Antonella Guerrera, the UK and Ireland correspondent for the Italian newspaper and online publication La Repubblica. It's great to have you with us as well tonight. Antonella, welcome to the programme. Tell us what you've been working on in this extraordinary week.
Hi, thanks for having me. Well, of course, you know what is going on in Iran, the Gulf, and especially the reaction of the UK and the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, because for the first time, he distanced himself from Donald Trump, because in the recent months he was always very, very respectful. He never tried to upset him. But I mean, it was a big contrast if you think about the last G7, when when Keir Starmer even picked a few documents up, I mean, from the ground for Donald Trump, and now instead, I mean, for the first time, he disagreed with him, and he said, "No, we're not going to be part of this." It is also for obvious, reasons. One of these is because the left wing of his party now is really strong, and also because what happened in Iraq in 2003 was what really caused the fall of Tony Blair in the previous Labour government.
You called his response, I think, this week less Churchill, Keir Starmer's response, more Hugh Grant.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, because we remember the movie Love, actually, when Hugh Grant, who is the British Prime Minister, he responds and reacts against this bullish US president. And this was quite extraordinary here in London, also because, President Trump kind of tried to provoke Starmer, like in the Oval Office, he said he's no Churchill. I'm very disappointed. But this is, I think, it might be also, a lifeline for Starmer, because we saw also in other countries, when, like, with the Australian Prime Minister Albanese, in Canada with Mark Carney. Then when they clashed with Trump, they had a surge in the polls, which is actually what Keir Starmer needs now. But apart from internal politics, this is it's a very delicate matter for the UK, because, as we saw, the British military base in Cyprus has been attacked, and so Starmer is really walking on a very tight line.
A brief point as well, Antonello, you wrote about political dance at Westminster this week under the headline, Westminster MPs dance amid Iran crisis, quote, like violins before the Titanic.
Yeah, to be honest, you are referring what happened in Parliament, because I was there, because I'm a parliamentary reporter. And this scene was quite controversial, because we are in the middle, maybe on the brink of a third world war. I mean, many people say that. Other analysts say no, but still, it's a very tense moment. And then, because there was this was a pre-planned event in the House of Commons with a popular TV dancing program. But this happened exactly in those hours when the British military base got attacked in Cyprus. And also, there is a big controversy here, because the UK hasn't been able yet to send the destroyer, the HMS Dragon, the warship, a warship to the area to protect that basis, which of course, caused so many comments, like especially from the tabloids and the more conservative press, say this is a utter humiliation for us, because, from the glorious Royal Navy, and now we are in this situation. And the paradox is that this ship is not gonna leave for at least next week. Wow. And so it may be because it's under maintenance, and after that it will take another between 5 or 7 days to reach the area. So that's why those scenes in Parliament has been compared, as you rightly said, to the violence on the sinking Titanic, because the contrast between the two objects was absolutely excruciating.
Just adding to the frame of Britain and the government being on the back foot. Great to have you with us as well tonight, Antonello. We're looking forward to hear your thoughts. Let's begin. Around 9:45 Saturday morning in Tehran, 8:15 in Tel Aviv, 1:15 in the early hours in Washington was the moment when the first missile struck Iran. What the US has called Operation Epic Fury, the Israelis have called Operation Roaring Lion. The narrative for the first few hours came from President Trump's 8-minute video released on social media listing threats and violence from Tehran for 47 years since the revolution. It was a message to the Iranian people to rise up and a message to the Revolutionary Guard who protect the Supreme Leader, disarm, that they will be given an amnesty or be killed. All of this came just hours after the conclusion of mediated talks between the US and Iran in Geneva that ended without an agreement on Iran giving up its nuclear program. By nightfall Saturday, and with Iran striking back, the news was confirmed on Iranian state TV. The Ayatollah had been killed. Footage shown on TV was of people mourning, not the celebrations on the streets. Those who dared celebrate were doing so only 6 weeks after the brutal suppression of anti-government protests. Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of War, has spoken of a laser-focused mission. The Iranian regime, he says, was, quote, toast, with their capabilities evaporating by the hour. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi posting a picture on social media of graves being dug for 160 people said to have been killed when a missile hit a girls' school in the city of Minab. He had the caption with it, "This is how the rescue promised by Mr. Trump looks in reality." Well, in a rapidly moving event of the past 7 days, Washington says it's now increasing firepower, that a new phase of war is beginning.
It's more fighter squadrons, it's more capabilities, it's more defensive capabilities, and it's more bomber pulses more frequently. The amount of firepower over Iran and over Tehran is about to surge dramatically.
President Trump, meanwhile, said he's looking this week for an Iranian Delcy Rodriguez, the equivalent of the Venezuelan deputy president who replaced her boss, Nicolas Maduro, captured by the US in January, and resumed diplomatic ties this week. But the talk from Iran is that the second eldest son of the Ayatollah, Mojtaba Khamenei, is the frontrunner now to succeed his father. While here in Europe, leaders have been sending carefully calibrated messages of their view of the war, some largely silent, and there's no unified position. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, taking to social media saying this: it's a credible transition in Iran that is urgently needed. Whereas Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez risked the wrath of President Trump by refusing to allow the US use of Spanish military bases for Iran operations. President Trump calling Spain terrible, saying he's cutting off all trade. The Spanish PM justifying his actions on social media, saying one can be against a hateful regime, as is the case in Iran, at the same time be against an unjustified, dangerous intervention. Let's go to Jerusalem first. Let's bring in Jason Burke again. Can we start, Jason, with why all this is happening now and the differing reasons being given for the justification? What have you made of the mixed messages?
I think that there are two different things that are going on. I mean, one is the mixed messages about how this ends, if you like, and that is really very confusing. We hear from one senior US official that there isn't a regime change or intention of regime change. Then we also hear from the president himself that he wants to select the next leader of Iran himself. So that's confusing. We thought that the nuclear program was the principal issue that the US were interested in, others as well. What we do know and what we can say with some certainty is that this has been escalating for a couple of years now. I mean, it really goes back to 2023. I mean, for Benjamin Netanyahu, it goes back decades. He's been warning as Prime Minister of Israel that Iran is an existential threat for 20 years or more. But really, we're looking at the last couple of years, two rounds of a shooting war between Israel and Iran, exchanges of rocket fire and so forth, and one that ended with the 12-day conflict that we saw last summer, which, as I say, ended with Donald Trump sending US bombers to destroy bunkers that held or were central to the Iranian nuclear program. And that was unfinished business. And I think it was clear to a lot of us in the region that that war ended inconclusively, despite the claims that it was a conclusive victory, and that there would probably be another round at some stage. I think the critical moment came in January with the unrest in Iran. which saw thousands, possibly tens of thousands killed, but by the regime as they protested, demanded freedom and much else. But the critical moment came when Donald Trump, in his intemperate fashion, told those protesters that he was prepared to back them, that he would back them and support them, and that the US was coming, and began a military buildup. And once that would happen, I think it was very difficult for both sides to find any kind of common ground. And at that point, the kind of violence that we're seeing now, the war that we're seeing now, triggered by a joint US-Israeli offensive a week ago, that was always inevitable.
There was a fascinating piece in the Financial Times this week, Jason, which was titled "Inside the Plan to Kill Khamenei." And it had sort of talked about all the traffic cameras around Tehran that had been hacked for years, heavily kind of focused around Pasteur Street in Tehran, where his office was, where he said, we're told that it was bombed and he was killed in those early hours, 9 o'clock or so in Tehran. Following highly trained staff, the bodyguards, the lower level staff, to a minutiae of details. I know you've looked at this as well, Jason. If we talk operationally, tell us about what you make of the success in the Israelis, the US getting their chief target.
Well, I think, again, you need to go back quite a long way. I mean, the Israelis decided that Iran was an existential threat 20 years ago, and particularly in the last 10 years have devoted enormous resources to gathering information about potential targets, about their enemies in Iran. And that is a really complex process, one that involves multiple streams of information, some of which will be coming from intercepts, communication intercepts, surveillance, some from the sort of thing you're talking about, hacked traffic cameras, for example, whatever. But really, that it will be put together with information possibly from human sources, more likely just from, a whole variety of different places, put together into incredibly detailed dossier on the principal target, in this case, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, but also everybody around him. And they'll be looking at, what the most extraordinary detail. And we know they've got it because, for example, in 2024, the Israelis killed Ismail Haniyeh, the very senior Hamas official in Tehran, in a guest house, in his favorite bedroom. And they had that kind of detail. Wow. When they've been taking out nuclear scientists, they have similar precision. So they really got inside the Islamic Republic and built up those targeting files, which allowed them, when they get the window of opportunity in terms of actually launching a strike, to make it very, very precise. The question is afterwards, though, where does that take you? Okay, so, they've taken out the Supreme Leader, they've taken out a lot of the senior commanders. How do you then move to achieving a strategic aim? And that takes us back to this whole question of what exactly are they seeking to do? And here, the Israelis and the US have slightly different ideas. And that, I think that will be a dynamic in the days and weeks to come that's worth watching.
Viv, listening to Jason, and also just aware of, while we're on air, we're hearing from Caroline Levitt, the White House Press Secretary, saying this: the US is well on its way, quote, to controlling Iranian airspace. We expect achievable US objectives to be completed in 4 to 6 weeks.
I think just picking up from what Jason says, we don't know what those objectives, as Caroline Levitt puts it, are. And it's not at all clear that the US objectives, if they're even coherent, which we're not quite sure that they are the same as Israel's. And at some point, in fact, it probably really has diverged. You have the leadership decapitated in some ways. In some would say, take the win. But that's clearly not what the US has in mind. The real problem, I think, with the US is that you have something that has set off a chain reaction, which is clearly proliferating across the region. You have something like 10 countries who are now involved. You have the global oil markets. You have the global financial markets. You have the entire, artificial intelligence industry, which is now basically being built up in the Gulf. You have so many different dynamics, and it could reverberate for years. And yet, in Washington, you have the president sort of announcing these very kind of almost flippant statements in his baseball cap, and then like pivoting to talking about his ballroom. It's completely, it's a total disjuncture, exactly, between the reality on the ground, this incredible chain of events that could be the most serious in decades, could result in a global recession, and in Washington, everything's going great.
And meanwhile, we're all feeling it here in Europe, in Paris. If you notice, you fill up with diesel, it's 30 to 40 cents more already per litre. We're talking about prices of fuel, according to the Qatar energy minister this week, saying it's gone from oil $60 a barrel, now at $90 a barrel, potentially in a couple of weeks' time, $150 a barrel.
Try book an air ticket in a few weeks'
The kerosene prices for flights, yes, doubled already.
Absolutely.
Constance, let me bring you in, because a year ago, President Trump said President Zelensky didn't have any cards. Now he's asking him for Ukrainian help in defending Gulf allies against Iranian drones.
Quite a turnaround, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, what we've seen over the past week or so in the Middle East is essentially what the Ukrainians have been enduring for the past 4 years. Swarms of drones, swarms of missiles. And to shoot down those missiles and those drones, they've had to develop their own weapons and capabilities, because a drone, just to give you an understanding of how much that cost, those Shahed drones cost about $20,000 to $50,000. If you want to shoot them down with a Patriot missile, that costs you about $4 million. So you can see that you're going to run out of those missiles pretty fast, whereas the Iranians will be capable of sending more drones. So the Ukrainians have faced that issue pretty early on in the war, and they've developed what they call interceptor drones, smaller drones that can fly and intercept the bigger Shahed drones and make them crash. This is a capability that the Ukrainians had been trying to sell to Western countries for the past few months, more or less successfully, and the war in Iran has certainly put the spotlight on those drones. Now, the question is, the Ukrainians also need those drones, right? So will they be able to produce enough and sell them to the United States or other countries? And in exchange for what? Clearly, they're not going to get more Patriot missiles. Is it going to be more pressure on the United States to advance peace talks? Is it going to be more help from other Western countries with different weapons? We're going to see. But clearly, the Ukrainians have some card right now, yeah.
Very interesting. I've seen a quote from him this week saying this. This is from President Zelensky, Constance, saying, "We would like to quietly work with countries, both those we can name and those we cannot, to obtain for ourselves some of the deficit missiles for Patriot systems and transfer appropriate number of interceptors." So it's suggestions of a swap deal.
It could be a swap deal. The one thing that just makes me pause here is, again, the cost, right? Like, if you swap a drone, one of those drones that the Ukrainians are developing to intercept those Shahed drones cost only a few $1,000s. If the Ukrainians want Patriot missiles that cost about $4 million, you're going to have to swap a lot of drones for those Patriot missiles. And manufacturing a Patriot missile takes time compared to those drones. So I don't know to what extent they can do that in just a matter of a few weeks. I think Ukraine is just trying to, play its card as well as it can, remain also in the game, because this war, as we've seen with the war in Gaza, has shifted the attention from Ukraine to other parts of the world. They know that they can help the Western world with their defense industry, and they're basically showcasing it now.
Antonello, listening to the point of Constant and how President Zelensky's managing this and what his contribution can be, could you compare for us what you're seeing in the UK? You've talked about the strike on the Cypriot base at Akrotiri in the south, and the kind of panic, the fact there's a ship on the way, but it's late. The pressure on Keir Starmer, and can you compare that to perhaps Giorgia Meloni, who's seen as very, very close to President Trump, and the noise is off from the Italian government this week?
This is, I think, a very interesting question, because Well, first of all, Giorgia Meloni always she's proud of this special relationship with Donald Trump, but even her, even she didn't know about the attack, and Defense Secretary Guido Crosetto got stuck in Dubai last weekend because he was there for some murky reasons. Yeah, but that's a proof that she says to be very, very close, but maybe she's really not. That said, yes, I think the Italian government, they, like everyone else, I want to avoid a escalation, but because the UK vessels are still stuck in the British ports here, they are coordinating with the British as well, but also with other countries like France, the Netherlands, Spain as well, to send their vessels into the area, trying to deter new attacks from Iran. I think the Italian government, they have a problem with the military bases used by the Americans on the Italian soil, because this is a very tricky issue, because you have bases, you have American bases in Italy, like Sigonella in Sicily. But there are very clear rules of engagement, but they go back to 1954, sorry, and they can be always for the defensive tasks. They cannot be used to strike another country, because this would go against the Italian constitution. So Meloni, like Starmer, she has to be very cautious with Donald Trump, and also she has to make him clear. She has to make clear to him that there are limits to his strikes to Iran as far as concerns Italy.
It's interesting, Viv, that there isn't a unified voice in the Middle East, particularly when you hear from Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, kind of chipper and happy, saying he knows what Washington are doing, and yet there are others, Pedro Sanchez, saying this is a legal war, essentially.
Yes, I think there are different layers to this. Firstly, Europe rarely speaks in unanimity, as we know, 27 countries, 27 different opinions. But on top of that, I think that there's a layer at which they're also watching their domestic opinion. And certainly there's been no polls that have come out, but I am assuming that the great majority of Europeans would be against this war and would be very, very skittish about getting too deeply entangled. Firstly, you've had President Trump, who's spent the last 15 months essentially burning his alliances and, insulting Europe. So I don't think that the European Union is particularly in the mood to be nice to Donald Trump on a war that they were never consulted about, and that to them seems like a war of choice that should not have happened.
Jason, we talk about the popularity and polls. What's it doing? Is there any kind of week-on analysis of polling in Israel of Benjamin Netanyahu? We're in election year this year, and not only the 7 days of conflict in Iran, but also Israel striking Hezbollah in Lebanon as well. Is he taking some of his base with him?
I think his base is absolutely committed. It's not just his base, and I think this is what's really important for elections later this year. Out in the streets in Israel, there is almost unanimous support for this conflict. Israelis feel that they have lived under threat from Iran for many, many years, a threat that the rest of the world hasn't taken seriously. And so they feel that this is now being dealt with, similarly with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so I think that's really key to understanding what's going on here. The question for Netanyahu is does this really erase the memory of the failures that led to the October the 7th, 2023 Hamas surprise raid, which triggered this whole cycle? And most Israelis are not prepared to forget that. So the question is whether any success in this conflict outweighs that failure. And we don't know yet. We're still in the first week of the conflict. There have been less missile launches at Israel in the last few days, but there were a lot in the first couple of days. Have we got a definitive victory either in Lebanon or in Iran? Absolutely not. A lot could go wrong. So for Netanyahu, who is an inveterate political gambler and one who often wins his bets, this is another gamble. And it has to be said, at his age, it's probably his last. He's facing corruption charges. He will be probably too old to fight another election. And so a lot is riding on this. At the moment, though, it looks like there's backing for the war.
And I think I'm right in saying the President, Isaac Herzog, saying that there could be a pardon, but that effectively have to remove himself on the public scene. Is that right?
Yeah, effectively. I mean, it's really complicated, but I mean, Donald Trump has been demanding a pardon for Netanyahu. The president has been saying, listen, I can't just sort of write one and hand it out to him. There's a whole process here. It would be absolutely unprecedented in Israeli legal political history to just hand out a pardon, particularly before conviction. But, there is talk around that. Although for the moment, though, I mean, the focus here is all on the military aspect of the conflict. And we'll see in, a few weeks or a month or so what the political consequences and the economic consequences will be for the country.
Very interesting. Constant, listening to Jason, also to Antonello before, talking about Churchill and Keir Starmer, that he's no Churchill. It was, curiously, coincidentally or not, 80 years ago this week, of Churchill's famous Sinews of Peace, Iron Curtain speech, one of the words that have stayed on our lexicon, where he said this: from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. He goes on to say all the populations around the Soviets, or what I call the Soviet sphere, subject to Soviet influence, increasing measure of control from Moscow. Russia, once again, a threat to European security. We know the links between Iran, as you demonstrated. Does Zelensky see any Churchills around him?
Hard to say. As in somebody who would come in and support him against Russia?
A figure the most respected figure perhaps in the eyes of Kyiv right now on a European or a world stage. Is there one?
I'm not sure. You know what? Keith Kellogg, the former special envoy of Trump for Ukraine, used to compare Zelensky to Churchill. So perhaps this is Zelensky himself. I think, however, that what the Ukrainians have tried to do over the past 2 years with the beginning of the war in Gaza was linking the war in Ukraine with wars elsewhere, linking Russia to Iran to Syria, and trying to show the United States and Europe that by supporting Ukraine, they are not only fighting for a country on the eastern outskirts of Europe, they're also fighting for a world order that they want to preserve. So this is a war, this war in Iran that the Ukrainians will surely try to use to strengthen their alliances with the Western world. They will surely try to use it also to showcase that they have something to bring to this Western alliance. We're talking about the drones, how Ukraine is trying to showcase its defense industry and tell them, look, we have something to bring to the table here. Now, I think that there was a lot of hope at the beginning of last year about Trump being perhaps this Churchill figure, bringing peace to Ukraine. They've come to terms with those hopes, and they understand that sometimes they only need to count on themselves, basically.
To which, on that point of where Russia fits in as well, the Soviets, President Putin calling this an illegal war in Iran, saying it's a, quote, cynical murder of an outstanding statesman of Khamenei, who violated all norms, the US, of human morality and international law. Judge those comments for yourself, given the comments that Constant just said. Viv, a final word for you, covering the Middle East for all of these years. In terms of a crisis, do you see parallels in history, or is this a whole new world?
I mean, of course, recent history, it's hard not to be thinking about the Iraq War. We don't have a ground invasion as we did in 2003 in Iraq, but it began with similar messages out of Washington. This was going to be a cakewalk, if you remember. People were going to be throwing flowers at U.S. troops. And it took many, many years and many thousands of deaths before that country wrapped up. And it's still not quite back to stability, or not back, but it still is not a stable country. So yes, there are lots of historical parallels to be drawn. The problem is we have a White House and an administration that does not really respect history, and many in it are not particularly well versed in history. And that's a problem.
They pick from it what they will. Viv, great to hear your thoughts on it, all of you. Thank you to a superb panel of international correspondents tonight in a week where on the ground insider knowledge and expertise is invaluable. In the studio with me, as you just heard, end the programme, thank you, Vivienne Walls, Paris correspondent for Time magazine and Fortune magazine. Thank you to Constant Mode, Ukraine reporter for the New York Times. In London, Antonello Guerrera, UK and Ireland correspondent for La Repubblica. Thank you, Antonello. And in Jerusalem, thank you to Jason Burke, international security correspondent for The Guardian, one of the foremost writers, as I mentioned, on Islamist militancy, and the author of The Revolutionists, the story of the extremists who hijacked the 1970s. Thank you for being with us tonight as well, Jason. And thank you for watching and listening on the podcast too. I will leave you this week with Sting, who this weekend concludes the Paris run of his musical, The Last Ship, inspired by his childhood and the historic shipyards of Newcastle. We will see you in 7 days. We will set sail for the world next week.
And whatever you promised, whatever you've done, and whatever the station in life you become, in the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, and whatever the weave of this life that you've spun, on the earth or in heaven or under the sun, when the